Thank you all for being here to explore the really important connections between the biology of our planet and climate change. And basically, every aspect of climate change is intricately related one way or another with biology. Just to start with, all those excess greenhouse gases in the atmosphere come from biological activity. In the fossil fuels, it's the biology of geologically ancient times, the release in an instant of all that ancient solar energy trapped by photosynthetic organisms in the past. And an almost equal amount of those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere comes from the destruction and degradation of modern ecosystems. So just to start with, the problem that we face has these biological origins. And yet I would say that by and large, the public doesn't understand that the planet does not just work as a physical system, that it works as a biological and a physical system interlinked, and that biological diversity is at the heart of the biophysical system itself. And so on the 22nd of September, the United Nations General Assembly managed to discuss biodiversity because it was the International Year of Biodiversity, but to do so completely separately from the discussion of the Millennium Development Goals. Even though, as Pavan Sukhdev, adjacent in Cozumel 1, has, through the TEEB project, demonstrated quite clearly that for the 2 billion of the world's poor, depending on where they live, their actual income comes 40 to 89% from biodiversity and ecosystem services. The interesting thing is, so you have, most of the world has no understanding that it works as a biophysical system. Much of the rest doesn't have any sort of thought in their mind about the importance of biodiversity, and those who actually recognize a little bit about that are much more likely to think that nature is nice but not necessary. So that's sort of the perception hurdle we have to overcome. And if we can start talking about how all this fits together, we'll do the world a big favor. So let me just make a little set of points about the implications of climate change for biodiversity, and then I want to turn it around and look at this really important point, which is the enormous potential of biodiversity to help us address the challenge of climate change. So there's no question that biodiversity is in trouble. That was certainly highlighted by the Third Global Biodiversity Outlook. But what is not particularly apparent to many is how sensitive ecosystems and biodiversity are to climate change. So we're already at 3/4 of a degree warmer than in pre-industrial times. And we're seeing some of these first impacts, species changing the timing of their life cycle, species changing where they actually occur, moving in many instances upward in altitude or northward in the northern hemisphere. But we're seeing more beyond just those little ripples of change. We're actually seeing major impacts on ecosystems. And it is quite clear that 2 degrees, which I'll remind you is the number that was being discussed a year ago in Copenhagen, is too much for ecosystems. A 2-degree world will be a world without tropical coral reefs. It will be a world with greatly changed coniferous forests, at least in Western North America, if not in other parts of the world. And it will be a world in which the Amazon forest will be in the process of dying back and converting to savanna in the southern portion and the southeastern portion of the Amazon. So the Hadley Center predicted a few years back that that would happen at 2.5 degrees and revised it a year and a half ago to about 2 degrees. Well, recent models, which will be discussed this afternoon, which incorporated climate change and fire and deforestation, showed that tipping point could come as close as at 20% deforestation, where the current number is currently 18%. So the good news there is you can build back a margin of safety by aggressive reforestation. And all I've been telling you about is things that happen either before or at 2 degrees. And if we want to stop at 2 degrees, global emissions have to peak in 2016. And the other thing we know is that last time the world was 2 degrees warmer, the seas were 4 to 6 meters higher. I mean, what more do you need to know to realize that we have a first-class planetary challenge on our hands? So that leads one to ask the important question, are there ways to take CO2 out of the atmosphere to avoid some of those greater temperature increases which bring so much downside with them? And the easiest way to do that is called biology or biodiversity. So literally twice in the history of life on Earth, there were moments when there were screamingly high levels of CO2 because of certain geological phenomena, brought down to levels equivalent to pre-industrial. First time that happened was with the advent of plants on land, and it wasn't just the green plants themselves, it was actually a biodiversity symphony, including all the biodiversity in the soils, because soil formation also takes CO2 out of the atmosphere. And the second time it was brought back down was with the advent of modern flowering plants, essentially doing that process, but much more efficiently. So that gives you a sense that there is a serious amount of power in the biological systems and in the biodiversity of the planet to help us address this challenge. So if you take that, it's not a gigantic leap to reach the conclusion that doing ecosystem restoration at scale, which means at the scale of the planet, could really make a major difference. So I think it's reasonable to conclude that there are about 50 parts per million that can be taken out of the atmosphere and sequestered back into living ecosystems over a half-century period. Forests are a big part of that, but grasslands also are a part of it. How we conduct agriculture is a part of it. So in the end, our most immediate ally in addressing the excess levels of CO2 in the atmosphere is the enormous biodiversity of our planet. So the Convention on Biological Diversity has a lot it can do that can be useful to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. So Lastly, I would say, of course, that's not enough. 50 parts per million is not enough. We need to find other ways to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And almost every geoengineering project that you ever hear suggested is addressing the symptom of temperature, not the cause, which is the CO2 level. And so in all of this, it's the biodiversity of forests that will play a very important role. And we're going to have to think very clearly about it, because it's a whole set of land use issues, from land that has to provide food and biofuels and conserve biodiversity. And we also need to think quite clearly about the benefits from forests as opposed to monoculture, because in the end, to value a forest only for its carbon is like valuing a computer chip only for its silicon. Thank you.
Bueno, primero agradecer la iniciativa de todas las instituciones que han organizado este debate sobre el rol de la biodiversidad y el cambio climático, la ITO, UICN, la Convención de Diversidad Biológica, CIFOR, es decir, una larga lista de instituciones que son responsables de esta oportunidad. Tengo entre 3 y 5 minutos para responder esa pregunta. Simplemente quizá aportar con 5 puntos, si me permite el panel. El primero es una reflexión inicial que para el mundo forestal yo creo que debe ser una evidencia. Considero que la agenda del cambio climático ha devorado el resto de la agenda ambiental en estos años, es decir, los costos, los impactos, el sufrimiento vinculado al desastre climático ha hecho que los otros temas de la agenda ambiental se vean subsumidos. Uno de esos temas es obviamente el tema de la biodiversidad, el tema de los bosques, el tema del agua, el tema de la relación pobreza, comunidades rurales, pueblos indígenas y su vinculación al manejo sostenible de los recursos naturales y de los recursos forestales, ¿no? Y francamente lo que estamos viendo es que no puede haber soluciones al cambio climático si no entendemos que el cambio climático es simplemente un síntoma de la crisis ambiental global, y así lo entiende el gobierno ecuatoriano. No voy a dar una respuesta muy técnica sobre la pregunta, pero simplemente compartir con ustedes algunos esfuerzos que está haciendo el gobierno ecuatoriano. Eso es lo que se me ha pedido responder. Primero, creo que es muy importante compartir con ustedes una enorme alegría y un orgullo que tiene el Ecuador. La Constitución ecuatoriana, que fue aprobada en el año 2008, es la primera constitución en el mundo que le reconoce derechos a la naturaleza, es decir, donde la naturaleza ya no es un objeto, sino es un sujeto de derechos, y esos derechos de la naturaleza deben ser garantizados por diversos mecanismos por la sociedad. Es decir, en el Ecuador los ecosistemas tienen derecho a existir y a florecer. Yo creo que eso es un marco que nos permite articular una serie de medidas audaces en términos de nuestra política pública, pero también de nuestras acciones. Por otro lado, nosotros tenemos un plan nacional, que es el Plan Nacional no de Desarrollo, sino que le llamamos del Buen Vivir, porque creemos que el desarrollo ha dejado muchas deudas pendientes, sobre todo en lo ambiental. Por lo tanto, le llamamos el Plan Nacional del Buen Vivir. Establece metas clarísimas. Parte de nuestras metas de gobierno es una reducción drástica de la deforestación, ¿no? Y hemos establecido medidas y acciones prácticas al respecto. Voy rápidamente a mencionar algo que es básicamente un embrión o un germen de lo que después va a ser la propuesta ecuatoriana en materia de Red Plus, y es nuestro programa Sociobosque, que se parece mucho al programa mexicano, que no recuerdo cómo se llama, que mencionó esta mañana el presidente Calderón. Nosotros hemos… Proárbol, nosotros le llamamos Sociobosque porque nuestros socios son los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades locales. Nuestro plan básicamente pretende conservar, y lo hemos logrado, alrededor de 500,000 de hectáreas de bosque tropical primario y básicamente páramos y bosques tropicales donde estamos trabajando, beneficiando alrededor de 3.500 familias a través de un incentivo económico y un mecanismo que poco a poco estamos poniendo a funcionar en el Ecuador, que es un mecanismo de monitoreo y de control. Creo que uno de los grandes déficits que tienen nuestros países, sobre todo en América Latina, es el tema de la verificación de las fuentes de información creíble sobre lo que estamos haciendo para evitar la deforestación o también para acelerarla, ¿no? Y quiero terminar quizá, porque no sé cómo voy de tiempo, pero mencionando también una propuesta sumamente audaz del gobierno ecuatoriano, que tiene un pedacito de corazón que puede ser entendido como una iniciativa posiblemente red, que es nuestra iniciativa Yasuní-TT. Yo digo que es una respuesta audaz, porque el gobierno ecuatoriano ha decidido no explotar, es decir, dejar bajo tierra el 20% de sus reservas petroleras. El Ecuador es un país cuyas exportaciones, el 60% de sus exportaciones son petróleo y más del 40% de los ingresos fiscales vienen de la exportación del petróleo. Hemos decidido no explotar ese petróleo por 3 razones. Primero, porque ese petróleo lamentablemente está dentro del Parque Nacional Yasuní. El profesor Lovejoy sabrá explicar mejor, pero es una de las zonas con más alta diversidad biológica del planeta. Segundo, porque allí viven pueblos indígenas, además que han tomado la decisión libre y autónoma de estar en aislamiento voluntario. Y tercero, porque al no explotar casi 900 millones de barriles de petróleo que están bajo tierra, estaremos evitando 407 millones de toneladas métricas de emisiones de CO2. Y básicamente lo que estamos haciendo, hemos creado un fondo fiduciario para invitar a la comunidad internacional a aportar a este fondo, ¿no? El Ecuador está dispuesto a aportar el 50% de lo que recibiría si explotara ese petróleo y el otro 50% un fondo con aportes y contribuciones de países amigos, de la sociedad civil, del sector privado, para invertir en algo fundamental que es el cambio de nuestra matriz energética. Eso es la iniciativa ITT. A partir de esa iniciativa hemos hecho una reflexión que nos permite traer a esta conferencia de las partes una propuesta que es un mecanismo nuevo, y no es un mecanismo nuevo, sino es un mecanismo englobante, ¿no? Que va incluso mucho más allá de red, que es el mecanismo de emisiones netas evitadas. Yo creo que ese es el concepto del futuro, ese es el concepto hacia el cual nosotros debemos transitar, porque no se refiere solamente a red, que quiere decir deforestación evitada, ¿no? Y degradación evitada, pero significa todas las actividades productivas que de manera consciente y deliberada un país decide no hacer. Un país decide no deforestar, un país como el Ecuador decide no explotar su petróleo, y en función de eso evitamos emisiones. Es decir, es una decisión voluntaria, consciente y deliberada, enmarcada en este concepto que ha sido desarrollado por el propio presidente Rafael Correa y que estamos trayendo aquí como una agenda fuerte a esta conferencia de las partes. No se olviden, miren bien, apóyennos a introducir este nuevo concepto que es el de emisiones netas evitadas. Para terminar, quizá en general la postura del Ecuador es que no podemos tener un mecanismo red si no tenemos las salvaguardas sociales y ambientales necesarias. Eso es lo que nosotros hemos defendido desde el inicio. Esto quiere decir la garantía de los derechos territoriales de los pueblos indígenas, quiere decir la priorización de la calidad de los bosques. Para nosotros es fundamental la defensa de la biodiversidad y trabajar en el concepto de la calidad de los bosques, no cuántos árboles, sino qué tipo, es decir, la conformación ecológica de los bosques. Y en quinto lugar, y para terminar, creo que ya tengo un minuto, ¿sí? Hacer como una reflexión final, más que un informe de labores de lo que está haciendo el Ecuador, que creo que está tomando, digamos, las medidas audaces y valientes, porque esto cuesta. Renunciar a explotar el 20% de reservas petroleras es una propuesta audaz. Hasta ahora, tengo que decir, a pesar de que tenemos mucho acompañamiento, mucho apoyo político, el fondo fiduciario Yasuní-TT todavía no ha tenido los aportes que esperamos, y hacemos un llamado a la sensibilidad y a la visión de futuro no solamente de los gobiernos, pero también de las organizaciones no gubernamentales y del sector privado para ello. Y quiero terminar diciendo que definitivamente ninguna respuesta, ¿no?, para combatir el cambio climático puede ser una respuesta sin los bosques, sin las comunidades rurales y los pueblos indígenas, sin la biodiversidad, sin el agua y sin entender que la crisis ambiental es una crisis interconectada, interrelacionada, donde no solamente está en riesgo la supervivencia de los seres humanos y de las sociedades en el planeta, sino está en riesgo, yo pienso, la propia integridad del planeta como tal. Así es que yo espero que de Cancún no salgamos con las manos y la esperanza vacías, y para eso sí, efectivamente, un llamado a un compromiso real que está marcado por la voluntad política. Ya sabemos, el problema de cambio climático y de pérdida de la biodiversidad no es un problema solo científico, técnico, es fundamental el problema de la nueva geopolítica planetaria, y esta nueva geopolítica planetaria requiere de decisiones políticas, requiere de compromisos, y como lo dijo muy bien esta mañana el presidente Calderón, necesitamos acción. Yo pienso, al menos trabajando para un gobierno, que no podremos salir de Cancún si no salimos con algo. Para terminar, quiero decir, no podemos salir con las manos vacías y con la esperanza vacía. Así es que muchas gracias.
I'm going to try to respond this with almost bullets of information. First, based on what we have been doing in Mexico, particularly in Conavio, but and which I think are not only exclusive for this country, I think they are important for the rest of the world, at least for the mega diverse countries, or the countries with a very high biodiversity, and which coincidentally have not developed a large scientific tradition and then knowledge of their areas. And then finish up with things that have to do with Mexico as well, but I think will also to some point apply to other places. The first thing is that there is no way that you can manage your forest either for climate protection or for benefit of the people who live there if you don't know the biodiversity of the country. So the first thing is really to make an effort to gather as much and as good information on the biodiversity of the country, which is part of what Conavio has been doing, and there are some other examples, funnily enough, in developing countries like Imbio, like the Humboldt, like in South Africa, etc. That information needs to be especially in space meaningful. It needs to be analyzed to provide really useful information for decision making, not only for people in government, but also for people on the ground, for NGOs, for owners of farms and things like that, and make that information accessible freely to all society. To the degree that society is aware and informed of these issues, will be able to respond and to back actions for the protection of biodiversity. And the other thing is to establish in this process a very useful, a very adequate and efficient link between academia and government and society that really generates a virtuous circle of interaction, of mutual trust and mutual work. The other point which is important, if one has this, it becomes much easier, is to stimulate the examples of successful conservation and management of your biodiversity, particularly when it is linked to economic benefits for the owners of the ecosystems, and try and extend these examples as much as it is possible. In Mexico, we have the community forest enterprises, which are really an example of how to manage forests on one hand sustainably, but on the other generating incomes for the communities which are shared fairly, which are really motors of engines of social change and benefit in those communities, or what we call the units of environmental management, UMAS, which is not precisely forest or timber production, but management of ecosystems for a number of purposes, from hunting all the way to the exploitation of non-timber forest products, for example, which give livelihood to those communities. The earnings of these units last year was around $1 billion, which obviously if you distributed among all of them, is not the same amount, but it's certainly far more than they could get otherwise in transforming those ecosystems. So stimulating these areas, evaluating them in order to make sure that they are generating a stable management of ecosystems and fair share of the benefits is one of the things that needs to be done. I think one can work very well with this. The other is that as a product of your knowledge on the biodiversity of the country, to generate mechanisms of monitoring and certification of what's going on in the country with national programs or with programs like RED. And in this sense, I would finish with that. I would think that the only wise way, I hope there is going to be RED at the end of this COP, truly. If not, I think countries have to take their own actions in their hands and probably not be will not have programs as large as there would be with RED, but there will be at least some programs. We heard something like that this morning with NEPSTAT. But if something like this comes, or payment for ecosystem services, this should only be temporal helps in order to develop means by which the communities can really manage their forest and become non-dependent on subsidies for their livelihood. The moment in which you stop the subsidies and there is no other way of doing things, you are going to be back to base and exactly in the same position, or probably worse, because there have been a generation of expectations which are not going to be fulfilled. I would say that these elements, in my opinion, would be extremely useful for really harnessing and using biodiversity for not only for climate change, but also for particularly for the conservation of natural capital in the country and the benefit of communities and society. And I would stress that the main enemy of biodiversity at this moment is not climate change, is land use change, is the way in which we are deforesting and modifying natural ecosystems.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, and it's a real pleasure to participate in this debate here today. Let me concentrate my talk around 3 points. And I will try to be brief. And my first point is basically to echo what Thomas Lovejoy was telling us today. That is that we have to incorporate much better the biodiversity and ecosystems considerations into the climate change debate. And that's for that reason that I welcome very much this session here at the Forest Day 4 and the Ecosystem Pavilion, because that's very appropriate to advance this debate. Now, climate change and biodiversity are very much intertwined. Ecosystems represent an immense active carbon pool. Destroying biodiversity is almost always associated with significant greenhouse gas emissions or losses of sinks. And we know as well that climate change can destabilize ecosystems and cause more emissions. So we need to identify measures that can simultaneously address the biodiversity crisis, but also can contribute to the climate change mitigation and adaptation. And we know also that healthy ecosystems are the best way to and are the most resilient to climate change compared to the degraded or depleted ecosystems. So full support for the team of today, and full support from the European Union for that vision. My second point is more direct to your question about the international policy process. We are here in Cancun to take up the bits and pieces that were left over from Copenhagen. And really, I would like to agree strongly with President Calderon's statement that we cannot leave this place without having adopted a decision on the REDD+ mechanism. We are confident we can do it. We are committed to do it. And we would really endorse the view of experts expressed in last September in Nairobi, that the biggest risk to biodiversity is that the climate process would fail to adopt a well-designed REDD+ mechanism and is not capable of implementing such a well-designed REDD+ mechanism. So it brings us to the question, what do we mean by a well-designed REDD+ mechanism? And I think that here we should, in the decision that is on the table, adopt sound rules, guidelines, objectives, and modalities. And the basic objective is to slow, to halt, and to reverse forest cover and carbon loss that is consistent with the ultimate objectives of the Climate Convention, that is consistent with the 2 degrees long-term target that is in the Copenhagen Accord, and that is also consistent with the outcome of the Nagoya's CBD COP10. So we talk about REDD+, and the plus refers to the promotion of conservation, sustainable management of forests, and enhancements of forest carbon stocks. So in our view, the REDD+ decisions must therefore safeguard the biodiversity of tropical forests, ensure fair benefit sharing among stakeholders. Third, recognize indigenous peoples and local communities' rights and knowledge. And fourth, improve forest government structures. And we hope to gather full support for the development of modalities for the monitoring of social and environmental standards in the REDD decision. It's not yet a done deal, but we are really negotiating hard to have that obtained. Let me then address the third point, that I planned to spend a few words on finance. Because in a transition period, indeed additional financial resources will be necessary, and I'm proud to announce that the European Union has brought on the table, as part of the Fast Start financing, that is altogether 2.2 billion euros for 2010, almost $500 million for support of REDD+ activities in developing countries. So only for this year, $500 million have been raised, and you all know how difficult the economic conditions are and the state of public finance in Europe. So I'm really pleased that we can announce that today. We also support very actively the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility of the World Bank, because we think that is a very solid initiative that needs to be nurtured further. And as part of the overall debate under the 100 billion that will have to be raised in the longer term perspective, we think that 10–15% should go to REDD+ activities. Having said all that, you know that the European Union has a carbon market, the ETS, the European Trading System. And the idea has been raised to have credits generated to REDD+ activities, and these credits to be sold into the carbon market. Let me express a word of caution about that. We think it's far too early to do that, because there are so many uncertainties that need to be addressed, and a good, solid carbon market needs robust measurement, reporting, and verification requirements. And these conditions must be met before any credits generated through RED plus emission reductions could be sold directly on that market. So in our view, that's unlikely to happen in the next decade. But we can use the carbon market and the revenues it generates, for example, through the auctioning of allowances. We could use that revenue to finance RED plus activities. So we have to be cautious when we talk about RED plus activities and the credits it could generate, and not directly establish the link with carbon markets, because we would like to continue with the carbon market, but only plug in new activities once we have very robust measurement, reporting, and verification done. So we are fully committed to continue to work on RED plus. We are fully committed to finance these activities, and we are very committed to have a solid outcome of this decision here in Cancun. We cannot live this place without having adopted a solid decision that is going to respect social and environmental safeguards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers of this panel, the CBD, ITTO, IUCN, and UNFF for bringing together this panel and for inviting me to be part of this event. First of all, maybe I would just like to say that actually from the indigenous people's perspective, we really feel that the integration or the complementation between the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Climate Change Convention is still very inadequate. I really think that that there should be more convergence and complementation between the two conventions, as well as with the Convention on Desertification, to combat desertification. From our perspective, it's really, we cannot separate all these different issues together, as indigenous peoples are ecosystems peoples, and anything that happens in any part of the ecosystem has a very adverse impacts on us, and we really wish to see a better integration. Secondly, I think the opportunities for convergence are really there, but it's not just being harnessed as we would like it to be. I would just like to give an example. For indigenous peoples, we have been, particular my organization, OTEBTEBA, we have been very active in the Convention on Biological Diversity. We have participated in relation to protected areas, in relation to CEPA, this communications, education, and public awareness, also in the development of indicators of biodiversity sustainability. And lately, we have been actively engaged in the Access and Benefit Sharing Protocol. And in the Access and Benefit Sharing Protocol, one of the things that has been very remarkable for the CBD is that indigenous peoples are negotiators. No? In fact, my colleague, Joji Carino, is a negotiator talking in an equal plane with the governments on how a protocol can be developed. So I think that is one thing that has yet to be adapted in the UNFCCC practice. But the other thing that the UNFCCC has contributed to the Convention of Biological Diversity is because of the opportunities offered by RED Plus, where we have actively engaged also in the UNFCCC, and we made sure that the rights of indigenous peoples should be safeguarded. Their traditional knowledge has to be reinforced and integrated into the process of RED. And our active and meaningful participation has also to be ensured and guaranteed, as well as the need to ensure that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples becomes a foundation or a framework for the implementation of RED as far as indigenous peoples' territories are concerned. So we have been actively doing this within the RED Plus process. I mean, it's the first time ever, in fact, in the UNFCCC that the word human rights has come into the picture. I mean, many years before Bali, there virtually is nothing about human rights, but because of our engagement, we managed to do that. And because we did that in the Access and Benefit Sharing Protocol of CBD, now they have agreed that there is now a phrase that also notes the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And the justification that they use is that this is already contained in the agreed, almost agreed document in the climate change convention, particularly on the red text. So I think that kind of complementation is really very much seen and used by indigenous peoples, so that the two conventions will really not be at odds with each other. The third point is that, of course, for the indigenous peoples, the areas where really there can be a convergence between the two conventions is not only on the issue of safeguards, but in the issue of the worldviews and perspectives of indigenous peoples. No, we have worldviews which are very different from the dominant society in terms of how we regard our relationship with nature, how we work, you know, using the values of mutual reciprocity between us and nature, between us and other peoples. And I think that kind of worldview is very much needed to influence the agreements that will come out of these processes. So I think that has been really pushed by indigenous peoples very strongly. And finally, there is really a need to push for the policy reforms, not only at the global, but also at the national and the local level. Because if we are to really see that kind of convergence between the importance of biological diversity and climate change, how we relate the two, we also feel that, of course, the ecosystems-based approach is crucial for this, as well as the cultural diversity. We cannot really separate all these four approaches altogether. They have to be seen in an integrated light. And this has the Biodiversity Convention is very strong on ecosystems-based approach, but this is not yet very much seen in the climate change convention. So I think that has to really be improved, and indigenous peoples will definitely play a very good role in that. And I will just like to end up by saying that Tubtuba and other partners, we have partners in 10 countries in the world, and because of the support that we got from the Norwegians and some other donors, we managed to really bring indigenous peoples to play an active role in the negotiations. And almost indigenous peoples, our partners in 5 countries, have become part of the government delegations who are now busy negotiating here. And I think that is a very good demonstration of what can happen if the full and effective engagement of indigenous peoples is ensured in all these processes. Thank you very much.
My name is Barney Dixon. I'm from UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center. My question relates to the balance between reducing emissions from ecosystem change and increasing sequestration or increasing removals of greenhouse gases. The REDD+ mechanism allows incentives for both reducing deforestation and for forest carbon stock enhancement. Sometimes the conservation community thinks that we should put more emphasis on reducing emissions from deforestation than on forest carbon stock enhancement, because they're worried about the way in which plantations may be established not in a biodiversity friendly way. But Tom Lovejoy suggested we should be thinking on a bigger scale of global scale ecosystem restoration. So I'm wondering what the panel thinks about the appropriate balance between reducing emissions and increasing sequestration, particularly in the light of their possible impacts on biodiversity.
Thank you, Barney. Thank you very much. Very clear question. I think I will collect some more. Please be very specific, and please do, like Barney, identify yourself first and put up your question if you want. I have one hand here in the front. The lady's bringing the micro to you. It can be put in Spanish or English.
Thank you. It's okay? Okay, my name is Muhammad Rafiq. Hello?
Muhammad, can I ask you to put your question here, please? It's because of the interpreters, it will be necessary. There is a micro coming over there.
Yes. Okay, it's working. Thank you very much. My name is Mohammad Rafiq, and I work for Rainforest Alliance. I have one question, one comment. The specific question I have is, to what extent the RED project payments internalize the use of forest by the indigenous people? If you want to hold the forest in stock, are they expected to give up the traditional use of that forest, or is it accommodated in that, and what is the mechanism to secure that? My other rather comment, and that's specific to a colleague from the European Commission, he mentioned of assurance, and this is more like an alert. We are talking about this huge system that will be implemented, and hardly anything has been done to secure the assurance, independent assurance that things will happen. So you may create this huge expectation, and there are currently mechanisms in the market, you know, there are certification organizations, but if you moved all the capacity, you will only be able to do a fraction. And what are we doing to prepare for that?
Thank you very much. Maybe we can collect one more question. I have a hand show over here. Sorry, it's very difficult. Two, yeah, I have Doña Patti, por favor. Gracias, Patti.
Patti Ruiz Corso, de Grupo Ecológico Sierra Gorda, Querétaro, México. ¿Cómo conseguimos aterrizar todo esta promisorio fuente de financiamiento en los contextos locales? Actualmente los protocolos, los procedimientos de certificación son excluyentes de muchas oportunidades de mitigación del calentamiento global local, de generación de riqueza para los propietarios de los ecosistemas, y son procesos costosos, complicados, laberínticos, que no permiten que esto se aterrice. ¿Cómo conseguir desarrollar y estimular esta acción a nivel más local que permita que estos protocolos y estos procedimientos se adapten a los contextos locales? Porque quien hizo los protocolos del mercado regulado los hizo desde su computadora en algún lugar del primer mundo. No tiene nada que ver con la realidad de nosotros, operadores de base de la conservación y el desarrollo rural. Entonces, ¿cómo conseguir aterrizar todo este bla, bla, bla en la realidad de los contextos locales, ¿no? Gracias.
Doña Marta es muy conocida por ser muy directa y objetiva. Muchas gracias. I will take one more question, and then we have to pass to the panel. I have a gentleman just here, and I apologize. We go for voting. If we still have time, we come back to questions. Please.
Yep. My name is Faisal Parish from Global Environment Center from Malaysia. Some panel members talked about the linkage between conventions, and I think this area of, I'd like to ask the panel members maybe to elaborate on how do we have this proper synergy between the CBD and the biodiversity work and the climate change convention, and how do we create those real bridges between the negotiations and mechanisms to make sure that we're really implementing in one planet, not a separate climate change planet and the biodiversity planet. Thank you.
Much. The questions are getting very nice now. I hate to stop that, but we have the voting with 5 questions, which will take some time. So please, if you allow me, we have 4 questions put. One is 2 questions, in fact. I'll go back to the panel, and we go for voting, and then if there is time, we put more questions. Otherwise, we'll have to rely on our time during the lunch break. Maybe I would like to invite for the first question that has been put to us by Barn Dixon, to Tom Lovejoy. Could you please address that one?
So I actually think we need to be doing both of those things at the same time, both eventually, and the sooner the better, getting ecosystem destruction and degradation to stop, so they stop emissions from that source, and at the same time, mostly using natural ecosystems, restore them to their previous state to the extent that that's possible, essentially using the living planet to make the planet more livable. And that doesn't rule out that there being some places where there might be monocultures of very fast-growing things that could suck carbon out of the atmosphere. But mostly this is a vision of managing the planet as the natural system that it is and making all those ecosystems simultaneously more resilient in the face of various stresses, including climate change.
Thank you so much, Tom. I hope that Barney is happy with the addressing it this way. For the question put by Mohammed from Rainforest Alliance, maybe I would start with Vicky and then quickly to Don Jose, and then there is a second question addressed directly to
Project can really, really internalize and really allow for the sustainable use of forests by indigenous peoples. No, if they are able to really provide direct access, but the indigenous peoples direct access to finances, for them to be able to develop alternative livelihoods which are not impinging very greatly on the forests. I think that is a question that has to be addressed, and in the finances that are provided for REDD, that has to be ensured. And then, of course, the sustainable management of forests by indigenous peoples has also been shown to be the reason why many of the remaining forests in the world today are in indigenous peoples' territories. So it's not just a matter of giving money to indigenous peoples, but it's really, the bigger question is really the policy reform that really recognizes some customary tenure systems of indigenous peoples in forests, which are sustainable. Of course, if they are not sustainable, we get rid of them, but we really need to make an analysis of what are the tenure systems that are most effective in terms of protecting the forest. So those are just a few of the points that I'd like to raise in this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Mohammed, your question deserves also some address, I think, from Don Jose. Would you help us with that, Don Jose?
Yeah, I think the first two questions are quite related. I quite agree with Tom in that you need to use a suite of responses and measures to address these the ways in which you are going to both maintain the non-emission of greenhouse gases, but also to have good and large sinks as long as possible by the management. And there are evidences that managed forests, that means that are being harvested, have a much larger capacity of sinking CO2 than an untouched, absolutely sort of stable forest. So it depends very much on how do you manage these things and the conditions in which you are going to restore the forest, etc. And the second question, I don't see any incompatibility at all in the way in which indigenous peoples use their natural capital and anything like has to do with REDD or other system, provided they keep their way of using these forests in the manner which has proven to be sustainable and second, economically attractive to them. It's happening in Mexico. There are a number of examples of this, and many of those communities are indigenous communities that are managing their forests with let's say, intervention or problems from outside. Can be done.
Thank you very much, Don Jose. I think it's very rewarding to get this point, that there's reassurance that the process is on and is on in reality here in Mexico. Mr. Delbeke from the European Commission, I think the other part of the question from Mohammed from Rainforest Alliance was directed to you. Would you please help us with that?
Yes, thank you very much. And indeed, we have to put the expectations right. When we decide here in Cancun on a decision on REDD+, that's going to be the start of a long journey. And what I wanted to say in my opening words is not to overdo the expectations. I see people immediately talking billions of euros or dollars that are going to be transferred through carbon markets just like that, as a finger knip, that is going to work like that. It's not going to work like that. It will have to be implemented step by step on the ground at the national, local level. And I think that what we have been doing in Europe is demonstrate our conviction that we are not only negotiating, but that we can put money on the table. As part of our Fast Start financing, there is money on the table. It is primarily going to go to capacity building, to support systems, to monitoring, to making plans and programs, and that is where the big work needs to be done. Before we jump to carbon markets and the big sums of money, I think there is a demonstration to be done that on the ground, good programs and good education can take place first. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jos. We have two other questions, one very smartly put by Patty from Sierra Gorda, and the other one from the colleague from Malaysia on how we implement the two conventions in the same planet, right? And the planet biodiversity and the planet climate change, the synergies, that is the reason of this session that we have. I may be too pushy to ask Madam Maria Fernanda Espinosa to help us with both questions, but I am tempted to do so because as a minister, I mean, I think should give us a perspective that would be interesting to hear. So with your permission, Madam, I would like to hear from your point of view on the two questions that were put to us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Me olvidé que voy a hablar en español casito. A ver, yo obviamente que no se me pidió contestar la pregunta anterior, pero creo que sí. Me gustaría reforzar la posición tanto de Tom Lovejoy como del colega de Conavio, ¿no? Porque efectivamente lo que se necesita es un set de medidas que permitan reducir emisiones, que favorezcan la mitigación, y justamente ese mecanismo englobador de un enfoque ecosistémico, que sea deforestación evitada, más recuperación de ecosistemas degradados, más reforestación y demás, tienen que pasar por una buena planificación territorial, por un buen ordenamiento territorial y por un concepto que es el que el Ecuador está trayendo a discusión ahora, ¿no? Que es el concepto de emisiones netas evitadas, que permite tomar este set de medidas, esperamos, a nivel global pronto. Sobre las dos preguntas, primero sobre el asunto financiero. Creo que la colega de México ha puesto el dedo en la llaga, ¿no? Yo pienso que es necesario que nosotros primero reformemos los instrumentos vigentes. Para países como el Ecuador es complicado pensar que estos 2.2 billones y todos los recursos que están sobre la mesa, tanto para mitigación y adaptación en nuestros países en desarrollo, tienen que pasar a través de la banca multilateral y a través de procesos engorrosos, complicados, que son inaccesibles incluso para los gobiernos, peor para las comunidades locales. Yo creo que ahí hay que hacer mucho trabajo para reformar los mecanismos que ya tenemos y tener cuidado de cómo se canalizan esos recursos. Por eso, países como el Ecuador y en general la postura del G77 y China es que esos fondos sean manejados directamente por las partes, es decir, por los Estados miembros de la Convención, ¿no? Y que se relativice la canalización de recursos a la banca multilateral y además que se faciliten los mecanismos burocráticos y los procedimientos de acceso a esos fondos, porque finalmente quienes son los más afectados por el cambio climático, por la alteración de los ecosistemas, la pérdida de biodiversidad, son efectivamente las comunidades locales y los pueblos indígenas. Así es que favorezco eso y efectivamente habrá que tomar medidas drásticas. Nuestra posición como Ecuador es efectivamente que los recursos sean manejados a través de un fondo especial en el seno de la Convención y de parte de los Estados miembros. En relación a la segunda pregunta, y aquí no hablo como ministra, sino hablo como una ecologista que he estado en estos circuitos por más de 15 años, casi 20 desde la conferencia de Río, y prácticamente desde que se instalaron los instrumentos multilaterales ambientales se está hablando de las famosas sinergias. y se ha hecho de todo en favor de las sinergias, ¿no? Reuniones, mecanismos de política integrada y demás. Yo pienso que la respuesta es a 3 niveles. Primero, a nivel conceptual. Yo creo que espacios como este es fundamental, es decir, entender qué significa la crisis climática, cuáles son esas articulaciones, ¿no? Y redefinir el problema. Como yo dije al inicio, a mí me parece que el debate, las discusiones, las negociaciones y las políticas en torno al cambio climático ha devorado la agenda ambiental y es necesario reposicionar esos otros temas a nivel político, a nivel conceptual y a nivel operativo. ¿Cuál es la respuesta? Yo pienso que hay ya un largo camino a nivel de estrechar, por ejemplo, programas conjuntos de trabajo, interconvenciones, y pienso que es necesario crear un mecanismo que sea explícita y deliberadamente funcione para eso, para articular las conexiones entre los instrumentos multilaterales ambientales. Quizá digo yo, porque estoy ahorita hablando mientras pienso, que sea el PNUMA, el UNEP, quizá que tenga esa tarea fundamental de crear mecanismos operativos de política, de trabajo, de planes de acción conjunta para articular las sinergias entre las diferentes convenciones. Ya digo, eso pasa por una redefinición conceptual de lo que es la crisis ambiental. Resolver la crisis ambiental y cambiar las relaciones economía, sociedad, naturaleza no se hace por decreto ni por la voluntad de un gobierno, es todo un proceso porque el que se está transitando, y eso, por ejemplo, gobiernos como el gobierno ecuatoriano lo tiene bastante claro, que hay que ir estableciendo hitos, sembrando para construir un set de respuestas y de alternativas que es complejo, que es articulado. Si uno resuelve el problema de la deforestación, pero no resuelve el problema del agua, si uno resuelve el problema, por ejemplo, del cambio de uso del suelo y no resuelve el problema de pobreza, ya sabemos que así no se puede dar respuestas contundentes a la crisis ambiental global.
I knew it was going to work. That's a very strong position coming from the minister. Thank you very much, madam, for addressing the 2 questions that were put to us. I think it's time for us to know who wants to be a millionaire. Everybody has the device in the hand. Is the system ready? So maybe I'll ask if it can come to the screen. You have in your device a set of numbers. And it's my first time using it too, so I'm not instructing anybody, I'm discovering here. I hope the first question can come to the screen. And then we will be able to vote. Is this how it's going to work? Yes. You can see on the screen, I'm sorry for the panelists, we don't have the sub-screen here in the front of us, but I noticed that some panelists are showing their hands and they want to vote. I want to vote too. I think everybody has one now. Yes. That gives us time to read the first question. Thank you. Do climate negotiators recognize the importance of forest biodiversity for mitigation and adaptation? You just have to press 1, 2, or 3 as you want to vote. Seconds are there. 9 seconds, 8 seconds. Do we have a show of result? Only 3% think that they are understanding it. 41% think that they are not understanding it. We have a majority that thinks that they're partially on the issue. Madam Maria Fernanda, would you like to comment on that for us?
Well, I think this is not a surprise. I mean, the outcome. Dios santo. A ver, A mí me parece que todo el debate que ha habido en torno a RED ha permitido efectivamente poner sobre la mesa los temas de la calidad de los bosques, los temas de la biodiversidad. Me parece que se está avanzando en esto. Sin embargo, efectivamente, me da la impresión que no hay una integración completa del rol de la biodiversidad en lo que se refiere a los esfuerzos para combatir el cambio climático. Eso me parece que refleja un poco el resultado. Ese 41% que dice que no para nada, me parece, realmente me atrevería a decir, con todo el respeto para la audiencia, que no es tan dramática la situación. Yo pienso que este año de la biodiversidad terminó bastante bien con Nagoya, y Nagoya sí efectivamente creó un halo de luz, una comunicación de luz para alimentar y nutrir las negociaciones de cambio climático. Yo pienso que la Convención de Cambio Climático ha seguido un proceso de maduración. O sea, el mismo hecho de tener sobre la mesa el debate sobre RED y de RED Plus sobre todo, pienso que es una clara demostración que efectivamente este es un tema que está sobre el tapete. Quizás ha llegado a la agenda un poco tarde, pero yo pienso que ha llegado y hay que aprovechar de ese escenario favorable. Estamos justamente en la bisagra entre el Año Internacional sobre la Biodiversidad y Río+20. Así es que yo creo que esa es la oportunidad, y yo no sería tan negativa. Yo pienso que ha habido un desarrollo y una maduración para tratar el tema de la biodiversidad como uno de los elementos centrales en el combate al cambio climático, y eso hay que reconocerlo también. Eso ha sido mucho en gracias al debate que hemos tenido sobre RED en estos últimos años.
Thank you very much, Madam Minister, especially for highlighting the momentum that has been built with the International Year of Biodiversity and with Nagoya COP10, and how now we are looking at how biodiversity can support RED+. And I think the momentum is very good. Let's look at our second question, which says, how much potential is there for synergies between the UNFCCC and CBD agendas? Number 1, little or no potential. Number 2, some potential. Number 3, large potential. Time for voting. 15 seconds for voting. I like this. How much potential is there? Dun, 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 dun. Yes. Mr. Delbeke, does it surprise you?
No, I fully agree with what is on the screen. There is a large potential. And I think that the potential is there in implementation. Perhaps we should not try to negotiate and to have formal links. We may just lose time. But if we, in the context of the biodiversity agreements and in the context of the climate agreements, incorporate each other's concerns, then that is what should be done. Let's not waste time in having long, formal negotiations. It's on implementation that it matters. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Time for action. I think some people, yeah, we have all the majority there. People want to applaud. Let's not refrain that. We all agree that there's a huge potential that has to be explored. I repeat that. What biodiversity can do for the process of climate change, not only RED+, for mitigation and adaptation. Can we ask for the third question, please? The third question says, how important are biodiversity safeguards, protective measures, right? How important are biodiversity safeguards for the success of RED+? They are not important, number 1. They are somewhat important, number 2. They are very important, number 3, or they are essential for the success of RED+. Essential. You do not work with that. We have 15 minutes to vote. Oh, seconds, sorry. Only 1%, somewhat important, 8%. Very important and essential add up to 91%. 31 is very important, 60% on essential. Vicky, would you like to comment on this?
Well, I'm glad to see that it's for us, I think it's really essential that the biodiversity safeguards are included in the REDD plus text, and I think this kind of result would show that there really needs to be a lot of work which has to be done to be able to really push that in the final agreement on REDD plus that can come out from Cancun. And I hope that all of us here who have said that can really do our work in terms of convincing the skeptics that that biodiversity is not relevant to the issue of REDD and climate change. So I really hope that we will do much more work in doing that for this whole week to now.
Thank you. And there is a very important work being done by the non-governmental organizations together with the CBD Secretariat and other international organizations towards helping definition of these safeguards. I think it's something that came very clearly in Nagoya that we are proud to build from it. We have another question number 4. Do REDD Plus countries need to monitor co-benefits and other impacts on biodiversity? Number 1, yes. Number 2, yes, in collaboration with stakeholders. Number 3, no. I'll repeat the question. In fact, you can drop countries there. No, I think that the word countries, as Don Jose is pointing out, may be a bit confusing in my understanding. If we read just, do REDD Plus need to monitor co-benefits? Oh, no, not good. Do countries applying REDD Plus need to monitor co-benefits and other impact on biodiversity? Would that work? Do the countries that will apply REDD Plus, we are talking about tropical countries, need to monitor co-benefits and other impacts on biodiversity? It's at country level, at local level, right? Yes in collaboration with stakeholders, or no? If the question is clear. So let's go for voting, 15 seconds. Countries applying REDD Plus. 78% of our group thinks that, yes, it has to be monitored in collaboration with stakeholders. And 21% said yes, anyhow, and only 1% said no. The countries do not need to monitor the co-benefits. Don Jose, would you help us commenting these results and the funny question that came to us?
If I understood the question better, I probably would be able to comment better. We understood that REDD Plus countries will be those biodiverse countries which still have good amounts of forest, etc. That's clear. It's not clear who are the stakeholders. The stakeholders in the countries, the stakeholders outside the countries, of those countries, is not very clear. I am convinced that monitoring and reporting and certification is absolutely essential to have a successful REDD program. I will go as far as that.
Any other comment from the panel? As I apologize for that. The question was not very clear. It's okay? It's okay? All right. So I thank you, Don Jose, for alerting us of the misunderstanding of the question and for putting it in the perspective. Just let me share with you. No, I don't share anything. It's we have to finish it now. It's a few minutes more in the session. Question number 5. Does REDD Plus have the potential to significantly increase the financial support to forest protected areas? Does REDD Plus have the potential to significantly increase the financial support to forest protected areas? Let's vote, 15 seconds. No, a little, or a lot? And the result is 56% of our group thinks that REDD+ can support financially protected areas a lot. 36% a little, some, or only 8% no. Anybody on the panel that would like to comment on this? Vicky, please.
Well, I think this reflects really the dilemma that some governments have, because as of now, there's really very little money for protected areas, no? And that's the reason why the plus has been included in the REDD architecture, because it includes conservation of forest carbon stocks and enhanced forest carbon stocks. But I think that if we have to be more holistic in terms of approaching the need to conserve, to protect forests, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to sequester carbon, there really needs to have more money also for protected areas. So that's.
It's a big hope, yes. Thank you very much. Again, I have to confess I'm not very good moderator. We are running out of time. We have a last question. Please bear with me. I would like to ask the people, IT people that's helping us, please, what is the main barrier to implement sustainable forest management? The main barrier to implement sustainable forest management. Unclear concept, number one. Number two, perverse incentives. Number three, lack of funding. Number four, poor governance and lack of political will. Number five, all of the above. What are the main barriers to implement sustainable forest management? The concept, the incentives that perverse and motivate non-sustainable management, lack of funding for SFM, poor governance, lack of political will, or all of them comply. We are voting, please, 15 seconds. Let's see the result of this interesting one. 2% think is the concept, 11% as perverse incentives, 5% lack of funding. Surprise for me. Poor governance and lack of political will, 37%, very strong, and 45% think it's all of the above. May I ask from the panel that Dr. Tom Lovejoy, how interpreting the results, please?
So my reaction to this, and it'd be interesting to hear from some of the others too, is that it's a complicated picture. It probably is all of the above. My guess is lack of funding may in fact be underestimated here in terms of the problem, but it really comes down to the particular situation in a particular place in a particular country.
Don Jose, please.
I think it is quite clear, and I don't think that necessarily the combination of precisely those factors is the right one. There might be one or two of those missing, but I would propose another question for vote. Are the answers to the questions predictable? Of all the questions that we had, and my answer will be yes.
Yes.
So who wants to say yes? Yes now. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We come to the end of this panel. I would like to hand over a big applause to the panel that has been helping us.